Hi everybody. With the correct microphone, it's way easier to be heard. Let me fiddle with the audio a bit. Good. How are you this evening? How are you all? So, another field note from the Metaverse. Comparing notes and stuff. Hi. So, let's get right to it. Before that, a couple of house rules, as usual. The ones who have been here for a while, or like it's the third time. The ones who have kindly been here before know what's coming. So number one, I know the topic of the metaverse is sometimes seen as quite divisive. So for this stream, we do want to have a critical discussion. Right? It's fine to be critical, it's fine to be hype, it's fine to disagree with what I'm saying. What I want you to do is be respectful, be nice, and then disagree with me in chat wildly. So it's perfectly fine. Just write what you think, but be respectful and inclusive while doing so. Secondly, full disclosure, I work for Microsoft on what you might call strategic acceleration of the metaverse, or metaverse-like technologies like Internet of Things and mixed reality. That said, this is a private stream this is a private project around topics I've been working for quite a while. I do not speak for Microsoft. I will not answer Microsoft-specific question. Like, keep this conversational, not go into company-specific stuff. And likely, I kindly ask you to do the same, so please no pitching, no sponsorship, no ads, no pitching, no shilling. If you want to pitch your project, community, or whatever, this is not the place. This is just a place to relax, let your hair down, and compare notes of what we've been doing. So to sum it up, be inclusive, be respectful, let's have fun, and skip the work talk. So today's topic is a fun one. It's a really personal one. It's something I've been doing for quite a while. It's economies in virtual worlds. And I've been thinking about this I've been thinking about this recently. So I haven't worked in the space for quite a while, but I've been thinking about it recently again, because I looked at Decentraland and the Sandbox. And my instinct reaction was, this won't work. So I really went back to my notes, my original notes, and kind of like, hey, why, to find out why do I think it doesn't make sense? Is this just like an instinct reaction? Am I put off by something that is superficial, maybe the graphics, and that's perfectly fine. You can think, is it like something around the aesthetics of the thing, or is it actually because I don't think something deeper doesn't make sense? And so I went back. I like got my notes out and like literally my old notebooks around, hey, how do you balance like social virtual worlds? How do you do this balancing thing? What's a resource? How do you like balance different states of things? How do you define specific things? How do you like go between PvE and PvP? That kind of thing. Just to get back into it. As I said, I haven't been doing it for a while. and I like also had these like super old printouts of things like, hey, how did our previous like virtual worlds work? Because we've been doing this for a while, right? Mods, MMOs have been out there for decades. And me personally, I was actively doing this stuff in the early 2000s. Back when I wasn't doing MMOs, I actually started out in what new world for young people, persistent browser-based games. Essentially MMOs played in a browser with static web pages as interface. Let me see if I can find how this stuff looked, maybe even yeah, this stuff, right? And essentially this is O Game. It was one of, like, beginning of 2000s, it was the shit. And it's kind of like EVE Online, but like kind of like the player is almost turn-based, but in the background the world is kind of real-time tick-based, and it's persistent, so it can log off and things continue happening. So it's kind of like an MMO. Oh god, not to my saves. It's kind of like an MMO, but very static in terms of this was even before Flash in terms of the UI. Eventually, Flash, in terms of the browser, Flash replaced these kind of static web pages, and then you obviously had stuff like Unity. But this is where I come from. I ran I ran a space-based game, and then I designed another one, and generally it was like early discussions. Like I came from AAA games on desktop, and then I did web backend stuff. And so I kind of combined the two. How hard can it be? And then I learned a lot around virtual economies, how they work, how game design actually works in terms of mechanics on persistent games. Because before I had mostly worked on single player games. And then, wow, this is multiplayer games. And there's a huge difference between like games that have a specific start, middle, end, and then persistent, which essentially don't end, right? So resource management and all kind of that thing, how to balance a thing that is persistent. And essentially I found it too hard. I got around with a like half trick. Essentially we said in our game, okay, it was a space game, and we made it part of the lore that the spacefaring like cultures came through an artificially stable wormhole, and eventually the wormhole collapsed, kind of like inspired by EVE, right? Probably, maybe it was before EVE. When was EVE? 2003, maybe at the same time. Anyway, wormhole collapsed, and it kind of like turned into this huge black hole spewing out matter. And one revelation of it was about a month, and after that, the kind of like the energy burst reached this part of space where the game was playing. So essentially, we had monthly resets. So it was kind of persistent, but we need to have the balance good enough to last a month, which we barely managed. And eventually we got better and could do it more persistent, right? But that was kind of like the beginning for me personally. And then I went into doing other things, and this is also true for generally like virtual economies, right? Eventually I helped Nintendo of Europe doing their web portal where it's about customer retention programs. For example, you can on the Nintendo of Europe portal, you can register your games, you get a currency called stars, you can turn stars into back then you could turn it into Wii points, which means you could buy games in the Wii store. Things like that, right? Or you could get physical goodies like merch and stuff. So it was also a virtual economy. It wasn't a game though. Even if you think like cashback programs like Payback, it's also kind of like a virtual economy. It's I wouldn't call it a simple one, but it's also a virtual economy, right? So I was doing that later. And then eventually I didn't do it anymore because I got technical director and then study ahead and things like that. So I didn't necessarily do it, but I still love virtual economy design and balancing because it's a weird mix between, it's a lot of math, it's a lot of statistics, it's also a lot of fiddling, changing numbers in Excel and looking at how things turn out. And yeah, a lot of things come together in like virtual economics. And I really, really deeply enjoy it. So it was cool. It was a good trip. So when I was searching a topic, I was essentially asking, hey, yo, what do you want me to talk about? And what do you want to discuss and kind of like ask in chat? Should I repeat the talk I gave before in kind of like a director's cut, or should I do virtual economies? You chose virtual economies. And I'm like, oh God, I actually have to talk about this stuff. So again, I like it. I might ramble a lot. But yeah, it's mostly because I like it. I promise not to do too much math. It's funny when I thought about how would I actually like approach this topic, talking about this topic. I didn't want to go too deep into like math and statistics, but that's kind of like talking about cooking without salt. So I'm trying to do that. But we have to talk about a couple of like things. So this is kind of like what I came up with, what I want to talk about. And it's really starting what are virtual worlds. And we don't want to linger at the topic, but just like a couple of baseline definitions and framings. And then talk about what are virtual economies. And here we need to talk, I think, kind of like to go deeper and look at actual virtual economies, we need to talk about two things. First, what are the actual goals for a virtual economy? And two big sides to this. What are the goals of the designers, of the people creating the world, of the world operating the world? And then what are the goals of the inhabitants, players, however you call them? And then we need to talk a little bit about the like nitty-gritty things. What is a resource in a virtual world? What are costs? What are systems? And this is mostly game design stuff. Again, I won't go deep, but I want to talk about a couple of specific things that are important. I will give links where you can dive deeper. Everything I say will probably be true enough to continue the conversation into talking about actual virtual worlds, past and present, but it won't be the full truth. So I probably give you a couple of links where you can go deeper. And then I really want to spend some time talking about a couple of virtual worlds and what made them notable from an economy point of view, starting with Ultima Online, then Sony Station Exchange, Second Life, World of Warcraft, and then we get into the new stuff, specifically Eve. A lot of time probably talking about Eve, and then the new stuff like New World, Lost Ark, and the Sandbox Decentraland. So that's kind of the plan. If you have a different idea, if you want to talk about different things, raise your hand, write in chat, shout in chat. That's kind of the idea. So let's start with what is a virtual world. And that's an interesting question. I'll actually go with, and it's honestly a philosophical question, and that there are many answers to this. I want to go a little bit with a cop-out and show a concept that is actually from Richard Bartle's book in 2006. I will never stop talking about this book. It's Designing Virtual Worlds. And in the intro, he has like this amazing definition. It's literally the first thing he talks about. He says, the real is that which is. Imaginary is that which isn't. And virtual is kind of in the middle. It technically doesn't exist. It's like a not real dimension. You cannot touch a digital dimension. You cannot like feel it. You cannot directly see it. But it does have a real effect. It does have the form. It does have real value in it. And hence things that Ref Costa said, where essentially he said about the metaverse that the metaverse is an artificial threshold. It's an emergent behavior where you have so much value in a virtual world that it becomes inseparable from the real. Well, that's a super interesting definition of what is virtual. Well, and this answers the questions, are virtual economies real? The answer is, well, yes, they have a real effect. It's kind of like asking, is the real economy real? Because you cannot like touch an economy. It's like a construct. It's an abstract thing. Obviously, you can touch money that you have in your purse. You can touch, like, you can look at your bank account, but it's kind of also not really real in that sense. It's an abstract concept, and virtual economies are also real in that sense. It might be one or two steps more abstracted, but it's still real. So we're not talking about, oh, does this have real value or not? The answer is yes, it has real effects in real form. So this is kind of like the questions, are these things real? What is this virtual thing we talk about? And world is interesting. So first of all, a virtual world is something artificial. It's artificially constructed, right? It is an artificial construct, and thus the economy within a virtual world is also artificially constructed as well. It is artificially designed, every aspect and every part of it. And that is the biggest difference from the real world. In the real world, there are limits what you can design. It's essentially physics, right? Things in the real world do have intrinsic value. If I have a ton of iron, it has an intrinsic value because obviously somebody needed to like dig up, mine the iron. Somebody needed to maybe refine the iron if it's refined, if it's actual like somebody needed to refine it, and then maybe somebody did something out of it. But in between that, it has intrinsic value per se. And I cannot go and say, oh, I'm adding 1 million tons of iron in the world, like creating it out of nothing and put it into the earth. I cannot do that, right? So in that sense, the universe is a closed system. I'm literally not the creator. I cannot create things, and I usually cannot destroy things as well. I can change its state, yes. I can change its energy state, but I'm not a designer. I'm not, and nobody can like artificially create or destroy things. They can be influenced, but like in a virtual world, the world designers, the world creators can literally change the physics and the makeup of the world. They have full control over everything that is going on. And yes, that is even true if you think around concepts like blockchain and decentralized, and the idea is that the creators don't have, they still have full control over it, because they are the ones who subscribed to the idea of a blockchain and a decentralized way in the first place, and they can choose not to do it anymore at any point in time. They can even choose, this is the same thing where even like the people running the blockchain and defining defining how the blockchain works, how mining works, how blocks are validated, this can be changed and usually does change, right? If you look at Bitcoin, the block size did change, and it was a big discussion. If you look at Ethereum and how proof of work versus proof of stake, and also individual, like, so these things do change, and it's a social construct. It's a social agreement within the operators of the world, but essentially they can do pretty much whatever they want. And at some point, for example, somebody said, let's fork Ethereum because of the DAO thing, and they did. It might be a little bit more tricky, but generally the creators and operators of the space have full control over it. So that's very important differentiation. In terms of world, so virtual world are usually persistent. I talked about this before. It's a persistent world, meaning the world continues even if you're not logged in or even if you're not participating. Things keep happening. Even if nobody is logged in, the world continues to exist, and as soon as somebody logs in, there's an observer again, and kind of like continues in a persistent way. And worlds, at least virtual worlds, and I will go into this a little bit deeper once we get to the actual examples. You can roughly categorize them into theme parks and sandboxes on a spectrum. At least that's kind of like how we, as multi-user dungeons and MUDs evolved. This was kind of like one of the big splits where some said, okay, I want to be a theme park where the most important thing is I give the players an experience. I want them to have, for example, fun. I want them to experience something, and I can essentially lean back and be, for example, entertained. At the other end of the spectrum are sandboxes, where it's more around the exploration and player-driven agenda versus the world-driven agenda. Players drive the agenda. Players drive, for example, the actions they do. Example difference, in a theme park, you would have a world story that provides conflict, that provides you the basis for actual gameplay and things you need to do, but it's world driven, and you're kind of like the observer who engages with what is going on with the world. For example, the world boss is coming, you need to kill him. While sandboxes, that's mostly player driven. Players provide the conflict, players provide the things to be overcome. And this is a spectrum, right? There's many things in between. And we will talk about that kind of like concept if we go into the specific examples. And if we talk about economies, this is where it kind of gets interesting. What are virtual economies? So, virtual world, what is an economy? A virtual economy is kind of like anything that deals with the exchange of in-game resources or in-world resources. And I later get to what's a resource and what is cost. But it's interesting to look at what are actual goals by people. And again, there are two groups that we need to look at. We need to look at designers, and we need to look at inhabitants. Designers, at the end of the day, a virtual world is most likely a commercial product created by an organization, very, very likely to make money. So ultimately, the ultimate design goal of this world is to make money. 99% of the time, right? World of Warcraft is not a charity. It's a game made by Blizzard. Blizzard wants to make money with it. because they need to pay a lot of people working very hard on that game. And virtual worlds are very expensive to make. They're very complicated to make. But if you look at, okay, that's the purpose of the virtual world, but how does an economy come in? Well, the goal of a virtual economy, and I said it's everything that kind of like deals with the exchange of resources. The goal of a virtual economy on like a macro level is to drive forward the goals of the virtual world. The purpose of your, and this is a design question, right? What is the purpose of your virtual world? What do you want to offer to the players? Is it fun? Is it like comedic fun? Is it like you want to go out? What's the aesthetics? What is it that once they turn off the game is left? And within the game, what's kind of like the feeling and emotion you want to convey? Is it, haha, this is cool? Is it like fun? Is it comedic fun? Is it hard work and the feeling to have overcome a big challenge? Is it like grandiose entertainment? Is it being part of a space opera? And these all are goals, right? This is mostly a design choice by the design team. What is my world actually about? What do we want the player to do in the world? Do we want them to have economic power? So many, many, many different goals that I could talk about. But on a micro level, the goal of every economy is to achieve balance. And balance is a very interesting word. It's very hard to define what balance actually is. There are entire books on game design that start with multiple definitions of what balance is. An oversimplified but kind of like good rule of thumb what balance is, it means that the designated group of people that are playing your game, if they play it in the intended way, they perceive the world as fair. Now, fairness is an interesting word. Fairness exists in the state that you want. Again, your virtual world might have different goals in terms of experiences. So for example, in your virtual world economy, and if you contrast that to a real world economy, again, there are different definitions what a real world economy tries to achieve, but usually it's to achieve Pareto optimal state, or a Pareto optimal state. Simply put, it's a real world economy strives to get to a point where no exchange of goods can happen without one being worse off afterwards, right? It's kind of like where everybody has the right amount of resources, and they cannot give anything away without being unhappy. The fun thing is that also has different definitions how to achieve that. Does that mean everybody needs to have the same? And like, do we make everybody the same? Yeah, that kind of achieves the goal, has other problems. Do we say that, for example, people who with big impacts like corporations can have more, but other people who are I'm not talking about real economy. But virtual economies are not bound by those rules. They literally can exist to encourage conflict. So in a sense, they might be very, very unfair from the start, where they might not even be capable of achieving Pareto optimal state. The goal might be to create a monopoly. They might encourage oligopolies. They might encourage fraud fraud and conflict and might actually be part of the game mechanics or the overall intent of the game. If you think player versus player, if you think a Fortnite as a PvP game, well, everybody has to lose because there's only one winner at least in this like battle royale, right? So everybody has, except one, has to lose. Obviously, that would never be the goal in the real world, at least not from a like macroeconomic point of view, but it might be in games. It might absolutely make sense. If you think PvP games, of course, most of the people will lose in PvP games to make a couple of people feel good and win. And the question of fairness comes in that if the game is short enough and like has short enough cycles and loops within it, even if it's a persistent world, let's say even in a persistent world, I go in a PvP arena and a game roughly takes 15 minutes. If overall the chance for me is I perceive it that if I'm the better player, I can beat everybody else and be the single winner, and I'm not always the loser, or at least I know why I lost because maybe I suck at the game or I don't have good enough items, then I can perceive it as fair. Even though ultimately it's, if you look at it from a macro level, it's very, very unfair and most people lose. So fairness is an interesting one. But designers of virtual worlds usually talk about balance, and balance can be usually like perceived fairness. So, interesting, complicated, yeah. In terms of what players want or what inhabitants want, that's also an interesting one. And there's something, so, again, this book, Richard Bartle, right? He very, very early, and I think this is from what is it, 96? Let me look it up. The Bartle taxonomy of players. The infamous hearts, clubs, diamonds, spades, players who suit muds. This is like the first good, almost academic look at why do people play massive multiplayer games. And he came up with 4 types of people, or like 4 groups. He looked at, okay, some players, can I make this big? Good. Some players like to interact with other players. Some players like to interact with the world. Some players like to act themselves. Some players like to interact. And I essentially say, okay, if those 2 dimensions exist, we can create a matrix. And he said, well, people who are acting with the world, and these are mostly systems, we can call achievers, right? I can run around in the world, I can collect, or if you think like completionists, if I collect every Korok seed in a Zelda game, I'm usually an achiever, right? The goal is to collect everything, to look at everything, to experience everything that is quantifiable in the world to get every achievement, right? This is why we have achievements. It's literally because people like to achieve stuff. They like to get the medal. And this is this quadrant. And you say, okay, if you interact with the world, if it's not just like going around in the world and experience what it has to experience and like get every medal to, for example, have a specific achievement. But if it's literally around, I interact with the world, I go with the world, I look at the world and I try to like look at every nook and cranny and go beyond what the thing is offering me as achievement, and I make my own achievement. For example, I want to get over this invisible wall to look what's behind it. I want to, I make my own goal of, in Minecraft, mining like making this continent disappear. I want to see everything that this world and system has to offer. So this can not only be part of the map where I can try to get into like closed off zones in World of Warcraft, for example, but also from a system point of view. I really want to see what makes it tick. I want to see how this specific game mechanic actually works. I want to look at what is a zero tick in Minecraft, right? So people who are usually like min-maxing or like almost like hacking and finding exploits, you would also see in Explorers. They might not actually use it for malicious, but it's like more like they're more interested in finding it than using it for a specific purpose. Those are the people you can go to and literally they know everything about the game and you get an answer, how do I achieve X and probably they know it. And then it's about interacting with other players. It's like, hey, I like to interact, I like to talk to players. It's a socializer. If you think World of Warcraft, these are the people who are literally sitting in Ironforge, in Stormwind, or in Thunderbluff and just talk. They talk to other people. They sit around the campfire. Lots of role players in here. If you think Final Fantasy XIV, it's about socializing. It's a social thing. A social virtual, they're not necessarily interested in what the game is presenting them in terms of the theme park experience. They make their own fun, which is mostly around socializing. Organizing in-game weddings in World of Warcraft. Organizing dance-offs in Final Fantasy. That kind of thing. And we have people who like to act onto other players which are killers, also known as griefers. People who like to, who get their fun by essentially griefing other people, by making other people miserable. And this was very early. Again, I don't remember when was this? No idea. What does Wikipedia say? 96. And this has been extended a lot. Like even Richard Bartle, when he wrote Designing Virtual Worlds in 2006, had plotted it over time, because he said, well, eventually people change. People might start out at a certain point in the spectrum, but they might move based on different incentives, or based on how they grow with the virtual world, for example. He also looked at so he added a time dimension, eventually making it into 8 quadrants. 8 quadrants, octa? Yeah, anyway, into. And this has been refined and refined over time, where now we have a very, very detailed look how people tick, also in social studies. If you want to go very deep, I would probably recommend stuff like Scott Rigby. He has a company called Immersive, which, funny enough, now is used to like as a consulting for organizations, so like corporations. He essentially consults corporations how to motivate their people, and his model is more around intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, and so anyway, there are a lot of models how to look at the question, what are actually goals of players. But mostly I think the Bartle taxonomy, those 4 players: killers, achievers, socializers, explorers. It's very easy to understand, which is very, very good. It's also a solid model that has kind of like stood the test of time. So when we talk about what's the motivation of inhabitants, we can look at, okay, players or inhabitants play because they fall in one of those four categories based on are they interested in other inhabitants, or are they interested in interacting with the world? Are they interested in acting or interacting? And if you think back to theme park versus sandbox, you can also see how different types of players might actually be attracted to different types of experiences. So let's talk about this stuff. Let's talk about actually game design and game mechanics. What is a resource? This is going to be a fun one. Let me take a refill. You all okay still? I know it's theoretical. Probably you came here to see me rant about, well, Decentraland or Sandbox or like Eve sucks. Oh no, I like Eve, but yeah, sorry, this takes a while. So, what's a resource? Again, I'm trying to keep this very simple. Look the stuff up. So again, resources are things that exist in the world. So again, this is fully controlled and designed by the creators and operators of the world. A resource usually let's maybe talk about two different things. You have usually when you talk about resources, you have two types of resources in a game. You have central resources and secondary resources. Central resources are main resources that act kind of like as common denominators. And most other resources, secondary resources, are somehow tied to central resources. For example, they can be easily exchanged or transferred into a central resource. Simple example, a player could mine ore. If you think World of Warcraft, you can go out, you can mine ore, you can pick flowers, you can kill animals to get kind of like fur or their hide, or but all of those can be sold if you go to a virtual vendor, an NPC, and get gold. Right? So gold is a central resource. You can trade or a lot of secondary resources that you get in the game for gold. But central resources are more than just that, kind of like what you usually think of the main tradable commodity, like gold, ISK in EVE Online, sand in the sandbox. Another example can, for example, it's also core things that are, or things that are part of the core gameplay. For example, health. If you think World of Warcraft, or if you think in EVE, your ship's integrity. And I understand not every game might have the concept of health, but like let's look at health, where if a player gets reduced to 0, they die and might lose other resources, like for example durability in their items. Then it's still a central resource. If you think about items that a player collects, armor might help the player lose less health in the fight. Potions that they create might also help the player replenish life. Even if you have a weapon by which you can kill monsters that attack you and want to make you lose health, if your weapon is better, then your weapon will kill enemies faster and thus make you save life. So life is a central resource, and items are also secondary resources that influence this central resource. And also things that might not be in the game but are tied to the game might also be central resource. Usually time is always considered a central resource. For example, players expect to have access to better resources over time, meaning the more the longer I play, the more resources I have. And thus, central resources are also usually measured in like gain over time. If you think like damage per second, gold per hour, how much gold can you farm per hour in World of Warcraft? Like everybody knows that. How much DPS does your class make? How much heal per second can you do, right? So central resources, usually time, usually like a central resource like gold, like an exchange commodity, and then everything that is part of the core loop of the game. And then there's secondary resources, and these are usually resources that don't have a central role, but are in the experience, are in the world to provide depth and immersion in the world experience. If you think technically, for example, again, World of Warcraft, a fantasy online playing game, you don't need ore. Like ore is part of mining and it's a profession. You don't technically need ore in the world. You don't need flowers that you can pick in the world. You don't need animals and that animals drop high. All of that could, even if you have an ore vein in the game that you can hit, you could get gold directly. Right? Why do you get ore? Why do you get wood if you chop down a tree? Why do you get? Well, because it's part of the immersion. You can do like secondary loops with it. Oh, I can make the ore and I can refine it. I can give it somebody to refine it, and after they refine it, I can give it to like a blacksmith, and the blacksmith is doing a weapon out of it or an armor. But that's mostly part of the experience, right? It creates it is part of the world building. Interestingly enough, the more usually like the more types of resources you have in a game, the closer you are to a sandbox. Because again, sandboxes think about how players make their own stuff, and they can make their own stuff through big economies. Like for example, in Eve. Eve is probably the deepest economy you can have in a game, where players mine raw resources, players transport raw resources to the people who refine the raw resources. After refinement, they're usually flown to other people who are utilizing the refined resources. Maybe there's like even like trading in the middle there, where people use transport and arbitrage in terms of, right? And people eventually make items out of it and things out of it, and then eventually these items are maybe part of a ship at some point, right? And then they enable other people to use the ship to go boom or make boom, one or the other. So sandboxes are usually very, the fun about sandboxes are these kind of like little things and how resources go together. While, and this is an oversimplification, while theme park type of experiences are usually like more of the spectacle, the thing that is presented to you through the world, but you don't usually need to deal with all that crap like refinement and other things. It's presented to you as part of a story or as part of a gameplay. And then there's a thing called resource distribution, right? And based on resource distribution, we get different types of games, which also has a huge effect on the player types it attracts. And you know this. You know these type of games because you've probably heard the terms. There's zero-sum games. So to get a resource, you need to take it away from somebody else. Resources in the game stay constant. Positive sum games mean the system generates resources and the number of resources is growing over time. So zero-sum games would be, for example, a closed economy. Everything that is, when I switch on the server, everything that exists in the world continues to exist and nothing really gets out. Everything stays constant. Positive sum games would be, well, if I chop down a tree, eventually a couple of new trees spawn, and that's, I'll get into how that works. But a negative sum games the system continually removes resources and the number of resources is sinking over time. And then you have dynamic sum games, which the system decides what to do based on a given rule set. And this can be part of fairness. For example, if you think Mario Kart and rubber banding is that technically this like is weird, where the system can decide that at some point it wants to create resources like time, and at some points it wants to shrink resources, and that might even players might have a different perception of resources and different availability of resources in a game. So for one player, I don't know, 1 million resources might exist in a game, and for another player only 10 resources might exist in a game, and this is dynamically balanced based on where they are currently in the game. So and this is totally impossible in the world, right? Or no, but it would be very, very complicated with like zero sum games. I could point to poker, usually like positive sum games. Negative sum games also, but dynamic sum games are weird. It's like usually it's in the real world, this is usually too much work, and that's kind of like in the realm of computer games. So cool. So the second thing, so we got through resources. I promise you, I know I didn't want to talk about math, but this is kind of like the most complicated thing. We're almost done. So what are costs? Costs are kind of like their direct costs. So example, I run, this is an exchange course for a system vendor. I run to a system vendor, an NPC in World of Warcraft, and then, how much does this bandage cost? Or how much does this potion cost? Right? And the NPC says 10 gold. Cool, I pay 10 gold, I get the potion. And this is used to set a ceiling, because probably player-to-player trading will exist. But this is kind of setting an artificial ceiling of, again, this is constructed and designed, and this sets an artificial ceiling and saying, such and such item, for example, this potion should never cost more than 10 gold. Because if a player wants to ask for more than 10 gold, then I can just go to the NPC vendor and get it there for cheaper. Now, technically, there might be other things involved, for example, travel time. And now we get to opportunity cost. The vendor might be here in the world, and I might be here, and traveling from A to B might take me 10 minutes. So I could ask for more money than this 10 gold, the artificial ceiling, because the opportunity costs are, well, how much worth is that 10 minutes to you? 2 gold? You give me 12? You can go there. So they are setting the ceiling, but opportunity cost is kind of like the value of a resource when used in a specific game context. And it's also things like, I have a health potion and I have a bandage. Which one do I use in which situation? The bandage gives me 100 life health points, but over 20 seconds. The potion gives me 60 health points, but within 1 second. So this gives me more, but it takes more time. I heal over time. This one gives me it immediately, but a little bit less. So in which situation do I use what? And should I save the health potion? Because obviously it's very valuable to get that. And this is kind of like opportunity. And the interesting thing here is, especially in persistent games, item with low perceived value are essentially never used. And normal balanced items will be rarely used, which means, have you ever played like games where technically you had a lot of health potions, but you never used them because you never knew when you need them? And at the end of the game, you had like 50 health points. It's kind of like, especially in like games like what's a good example? Shooters, where ammunition is usually very scarce, like special types of shooters, like I don't know, Metal Gear Solid, I try to be as efficient with my ammunition as possible because I knew it's part of the gameplay that munition is rare. So reloading is you need to conserve your resources. But that led to me swinging wildly in the other direction, and I ended the game with probably 1,000 rounds of ammunition. I'm exaggerating, but I was so in like it completely had the other effect where the design intention was probably to use it rarely but still use it, but essentially I swung totally in the other direction and never use it. And this is actually common. So underbalanced items are never used. Fairly balanced items will still be rarely used, and only high impact items will be used regularly. So that's kind of how you think of costs. Costs are very weird. And then systems, last thing, let's talk about systems for a minute. Again, in a very, very abstracted way. Systems are a chain of individual game mechanics that influence player access to resource. So example, player kills a monster, the monster drops items, which are resources. Fighting mobs is the system, it's fight mob system. And the individual way the fight is happening are the mechanics. I could use magic, I could hit, but the overall game loop is me kill monster, me get resource. So, and all these systems individually should enable the overall design goal. And this is kind of like where I make the round. And balancing this is hard. The issue that everything is created and everything is artificial is you try to create the optimal experience for the players you try to attract. Why? Because every other game could also has full control, and if they do a better job at providing the experience, the players will go to the better game. And so balancing is hard. Every step you literally do is intentional. Every decision that you make is intentional. Even if you don't make decisions intentionally, some have unintended consequences, which can also be bad. And for a lot of decisions, there are no good answers, right? If items are too powerful and need to be nerfed, aka made worse, it annoys a couple of players that have that item. Because they're annoyed. Hey, why are you taking away power from my item? I liked this gameplay and game style of being totally overpowered and crushing my enemies. But you have to do it for overall balance. And creating that balance will infuriate some of your players. Like buffing weak, and the other thing, if you take weak items that are underpowered and make them more powerful, well, then you're creating inflation. And opportunity costs, what I just talked to, that leads to hoarding. Hoarding means things are taken out of the circulation. Time played leads to inflation. The more you played, again, time is a central resource. The more time you play, the more you're expected, the better you're expected to get at a game, but also you're expected to have more access to resources. So time played also leads to power creep, where things need to be more and more powerful to keep kind of like the game flowing. I'm used to, if your core game loop is I get better stuff by doing things, like in World of Warcraft, I get better items and my item level grows over time, and that's a core mechanic, well then you need to constantly introduce a higher and higher item level. Which also means if you have a specific content created for a lower item level, well, then that content is irrelevant because nobody cares because it's not for you, right? Players will only go for the content that gives them the higher item. So, and that is hard. There's game design and literally virtual world design is very hard, and designing and balancing the economies is probably the hardest thing, which is also why I love it. So, couple of links. If you're really interested in this stuff, there's I noticed from olden times, but there's an amazing channel called Extra Credits. And they talk a lot about, they're generally doing videos around game design. But they have a lot of videos around MMO and virtual world economy stuff. It's really, really good. They're like 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes blurbs, but they really go deep in what they teach. You can also just literally enter MMO game balancing, and you will probably find a lot of talks from the GDC, from the Game Developers Conference, where people talk about it. So, for example, one of these were like, okay, the lead economy designer of Albion Online talks about how they balance the game and the economy. So you find a lot of information about this stuff. And if you want to go deep into what are resources and what are game design, I would probably recommend this. This is from, who was it from? Ian Schreiber? Oh God, I'm so sorry. This is a game design course in 2010, but it's super detailed. How to design, how essentially game design works, what's a resource, what's a cost, like fundamental things about game design, game balance concepts. Super cool. So let's talk about a couple of specific worlds, specifically these. And let's start with EVE Online. Let's start with Ultima Online, because that's a very interesting one. Wow, 1 hour. And we're actually talking about the thing. You guys are still there? You okay? Let's talk about Ultima Online. Ultima Online is really interesting because it underwent massive changes in its time. And the reason it really started out as a closed economy where it was essentially almost zero sum, I think. And it just spectacularly failed for many reasons. And the good news is that this has been researched in depth, what went wrong and why. You will find talks by, for example, Ralph Costa or Richard Fogel. Damien Schubert wrote a lot about this. So the initial Ultima Online game designers wrote a lot about what their initial thoughts were, and then how players just did not react as expected and crashed the economy. And then what they did to eventually change it. One of the good ones, or well-knowns, is Zach Booth did and he was at Origin. He did a paper in '99 that really looked also deep into this. And this was the original economy flow. Without going too deep, it essentially says, okay, we have a system, a resource system that controls the supply of a resource. And while resources might be changed, the total supply of resources is fixed. For example, there's this global resource manager that spawns a vein of iron. The player mines the iron. The player refines the ore. The player turns the ore into an item. The player uses the item. The item loses durability over time and eventually breaks. And this is kind of like how it goes through here. It eventually breaks. It could, for example, be sold. Goods can decay. Eventually it starts from from this global resource manager. It becomes a natural resource. It gets eventually refined and done, and then Once it's destroyed, either by decaying or by degradation or by selling it to an NPC, it gets funneled back into this global resource manager. So this is typically what we call a closed system, right? Nothing goes out, nothing comes in. Everything that is currently in the world stays in the world. And the control you have is via the global resource manager. So what went wrong? Number one, this doesn't scale. If you have a finite world, and I say this is your forest, and your forest has all the spawned trees in it, player will come and destroy it completely. Why? Well, because players like resources. As the game grows, your world might not actually be able to handle the amount of players. And Ultima Online was the first game that introduced sharding, where the world was too small for the number of players and the players did not have enough resources to go around, so resources were essentially immediately depleted. It's like using natural resources like oil. Eventually oil will run out on this real world. And this was accelerated. The world was too small. The world was overpopulated massively. And this would, the word sharding as we know it in databases or in games actually comes from Ultima Online. It's part of the lore. The god of the universe smashed a crystal, smashed a crystal and essentially created a multiverse. Each shard was its own world. And so it created multiple versions of the same world, and players played on multiple shards. Each shard, a couple of thousand players. And that was seen as okay, we have a specific threshold where the world population is healthy enough so that the world can sustain them in a persistent manner. But this is where sharding comes from. The other issue was players sometimes are min-maxers. If I need wood, I go out, and usually I don't only get the wood I need, because again, it's an opportunity cost to travel to the forest, so I get more than I need. And that eventually led to hoarding. Like the Ultima Online team was super surprised how much hoarding just took place. The amount of stuff that sat in I'm looking this up, it's described in the paper, but the amount of stuff that just sat in the item bank or in the inventory of players was absurd. Like, players started buying like this also concept of a mule, of a secondary character that you don't play but just use as a kind of a bank to put stuff into. That's from there. So while the world in theory would have been able to sustain the players if they played as intended, in reality, the fact that they hoarded and didn't actually use the resources to eventually feed back to the global resource manager meant it kind of got stuck in one of these stages. So there's a lot of hoarding. And number three, there was a rampant hacking problem in terms of duping, in terms of gold duping, which is also relevant because sometimes things will go wrong. You will have and that might be a development error where people can like create gold, but it might also be just like a mistake intends that somebody finds a thing that is possible but wasn't necessarily intended. So not a bug per se, but the ability of like essentially create a runaway inflation in your economy. Which is why after Ultima Online, the general wisdom is you do not do a closed economy in persistent games. Never, never, bad idea. What they eventually started doing, and this is still practice, they have an open economy where you have a faucet where you can inject stuff into the game, and you have a drain where you can pull out stuff. So, for example, in World of Warcraft is a pretty old game. And it has the issue of what I mentioned before. People have a lot of resources because they play the game for a long time. Right? People have, at the beginning of an expansion, it's kind of like a reset point, and at the end of the expansion, everybody has thousands and thousands of gold. And what they do is create these drains where, well, your items degrade. So they go broke and you need to repair them, and repair costs a certain amount of money. It might be an item. Hey, cool. Do you want this horse? It's an amazing horse, but it costs 10,000 gold. And what is initially an expensive and exclusive item might over time become a common item where everybody has enough gold. But you're kind of removing that money by making things very expensive, and then you're doing kind of a reset, right? So there are specific ways to add drains in a game. It might also be like Zelda, Breath of the Wild. Everything broke, especially weapons. It was so annoying, but that's kind of a drain to make sure that nobody's running around with 100 weapons in their inventory, and and to make sure that even if you get the most powerful weapon in the game, eventually it will break. Well, except of the Master Sword, but that's for lore reasons and for game story reasons. But every other item would break, and that's a drain. Right? You're pulling stuff out and kind of like making sure that the player doesn't become overpowered, and the same kind of you can do in games. And if your game is depreciated and nobody has enough gold, there's nothing to come around, and that means people do not feel powerful enough, you add a faucet where you enter money. This can also just mean you make every item in the game that an NPC pays. So previously you could hand in 10 flowers and they give you gold. Now you hand in 10 flowers and then only 50 silver. And it's pretty much the same thing where you just increase the amount of gold you get for example, killing monsters or doing quests, things like that, right? So faucet and drains are pretty much the standard in terms of an open economy, how now economies are done, right? Closed systems have been tried and they failed spectacularly in Ultima Online. And this is also pretty much in line in how the actual real economy works, right? The gold standard as a closed system was abandoned for a reason in favor of an open system. Because if those crashes happen in virtual worlds are actually really interesting for economists because they're kind of like simulations and we cannot simulate the real world. So Ultima Online was super interesting. And this paper, very, very interesting view on that in 2002. And there's also, again, lots of talks like these people who are actually the Ultima Online design members, they have done also talks on YouTube. So for example, Raf Costa did an amazing talk on how did Ultima Online's economy work. They did a retrospective as a talk at GDC. So Ultima Online is super interesting because there's a lot of they did many things because they were one of the earliest, right? And they had bold visions how the economy should work, and they made a lot of mistakes. But the good news is these are documented, and this stuff again is like 20 years old. It's well documented. Everybody designing virtual worlds should read this stuff. I feel like not many people do. Next one is Sony Station Exchange. And boy, this is an interesting one. Usually people talk about Second Life for some firsts, like, hey, we were the first ones who did like this real world economy stuff. Actually, it was probably Sony Station Exchange. So what's Sony Station Exchange? Once upon a time, there was a game called EverQuest, which was created by Sony. And then there was, and this happened also in Ultima Online, but it was really like an EverQuest where there was a secondary market for virtual items. So this was where in like early 2000s you heard, hey, an EverQuest 2 item, some virtual sword, a virtual item was sold for $5,000 US. Wow. And you had like these people who supposedly made a living out of playing a virtual game and actually make real money. How does that work? And there was this secondary market emerging, and this wasn't sanctioned by Sony Online, but it happened nonetheless, and was mostly like per email, hey, do you want to buy this? Doesn't really work. And then eBay came along, and a lot of this stuff was done by eBay. You could literally look up EverQuest 2 items on eBay, and then they would transfer the real money, and then they would do the trade in game. And it was a lot of scams where people would take the money but not like transfer the actual in-game game. So eBay banned it. And Sony had the initial discussion around, hey, this is our IP. You cannot sell our IP. This is our sword. And then there was this, what do you mean it's your sword? What do you mean this is your item? It's my item. I found it in the game. I played for it. I spent time getting it. And someone was like, yeah, but it's still our game. So this was like the first time this kind of like discussion crept up. Who actually owns this stuff? And Julian Dibble, all around great person, but he's like, he did an experiment on, he ran an experiment of, hey, can I actually, he's a journalist, he's an author, and he ran an experiment of like, hey, could I actually quit my day job and only live off doing virtual items, selling, trading virtual items? Pay to earn. That was 2003, 3 to 4. And he blogged about it. He literally documented day by day what he was doing. The blog is still online, which is this one, Julian Dibble /play money. And you can literally read the entire blog, his entire year. And he made the experiment of, could I live off of that and actually live off of that? So he would actually document everything. He would pay his taxes. He would do it as a real job and document it. It's an amazing blog, also by the book. Doesn't look red anymore, it looks green, but it's an amazing. If you actually want to know around, hey, how does this look from a player perspective? There you go, this is Play to Earn, 2004, an amazing document. But also this stuff was scaled. This was also the first time where you literally had these sweatshops of people in third world countries that would play this because playing this and selling items would be a better income than an actual day job there. And then obviously people scale it. Yo, you 40 people get into a room, and then obviously this was about min-maxing. So it wasn't about playing the game. It was like literally doing very, very repetitive things that proved to be the best gold per hour, and then selling gold, for example. And you also had that in World of Warcraft. Initially, like China farmers was a thing. Look up China farmer World of Warcraft. That was back then before you had, now it's all bots and automate, because hey, automate the stuff. But back then it was like literally people in sweatshops doing over and over again. And this has nothing to do with the initial intention of the game. This is just about value generation within the game, but completely separate from actual game intentions and the intentions that the designers had in mind. This is just about, if the best way to make money is just run left and right and pick a flower, they will exactly do that and do not care about the story, do not care about anything else, do not care about intention. So in a sense, if you think about the battle, they're on the achiever, full on extreme. They do not care about socializing, about interacting with the world or other players. They just care about this specific thing. And this is also play to earn is nothing new. It can be done if it's an actual job, it's good, but it also automatically leads to this min-maxing thing. Where if somebody tells me around people being liberated by accessing infinity, I'm just telling them, well, you have a couple of people exploiting, because they're not the people in the sweatshops do not make the money. The one who's organizing that and giving them a computer and like giving them access to that is making the money, and people are usually like getting if they're lucky, minimum wage. And the same is true with Axie Infinity. If you look at how the actual economy around that works, it's the people who are owning the Axies renting it out for a specific time, and then the people who are doing the play to earn need to hit a specific quota or they're out, and they're getting paid really, really badly. So play to earn is not necessarily a good thing. It can be, but it leads to exploitation. And then Edward Castronova, he wrote an economy paper on EverQuest, in which he found a couple of things. This was 2002. He found, hey, yo, you can make a nominal hourly wage of $3.50 per hour, US dollars. And by the way, the entire GDP of the thing is somewhere between Russia and Bulgaria. And this was kind of like an obscure paper, but it like really hit like a bombshell, because this was the first time where economy people, but more like the world, was like, what the hell is happening? Because again, if you think real, imaginary, virtual, real world value, and he estimated and he described the model, how he came to these numbers in the paper, but like he stated, here exists a virtual thing, a virtual world that is essentially the 77th biggest economy in the world, and it doesn't even exist per se. It doesn't have territory on the globe. So people like this was also a wake-up call, and also for Sony, who previously said, no, we this stuff is ours, please stop trading this stuff. And then Sony released Station Exchange. What is Station Exchange? Well, Station Exchange launched 2005, I think, and it allowed EverQuest 2 subscribers to securely buy and sell stuff. So essentially they said, okay, cool, you're trading anyway, we create a marketplace, and by the way, we want a cut. Because of course. So they could sell virtual items, they could sell entire characters, and things for real money. It was the first official sanctioned virtual to real economy platform. And after a year, they released a white paper talking about how successful, and kind of like back in the day, Sony Online was amazing. They literally let researchers look into their raw data, which was cool, but also kind of like published official like papers. And if you look at the paper, kind of like go through it, in the first year, they they said the platform, the money within the platform, the exchanges was around 2 million US dollars in the first year, 2005. The average like upper point of a character was around 2,000 US dollar. And if you looked at the higher earning sellers, they made around between 35 and 40,000 dollars per year on this single platform. And so Station Exchange eventually became, Sony Online did a lot of other games, for example, Star Wars Galaxies. And as these like economies there grow in importance, Sony wanted to offer an official place where these transactions could happen. Because first, they wanted to create a safe space where people could actually trade this stuff for brand reasons. Because a lot of scams happen. But also they wanted to take money because they took a cut for it. So this was like App Store type behavior before an App Store. It was essentially an App Store for virtual world games. And this is pretty much, they still didn't give ownership of the items to players, but they allowed it to officially buy and sell the rights to use these items, to exchange and trade these items. So this was super cool. And then I guess we do Second Life. Second Life has a couple of firsts. Well, first of all, it wasn't like, these are based on traditional games, while Second Life wasn't necessarily a game. It was, there we go, full on sandbox, right? Here we talk about theme parks. World of Warcraft is like the theme park of theme parks. They really nailed the formula. And Second Life was kind of like, hey, yo, how about a sandbox? And that was 2003, so it kind of like pretty much same time when Station Exchange became a thing. And it was like one of the first social virtual worlds where like it was a sandbox approach. And it also was one of the first social virtual worlds where, well, you got sandboxes before, but it was like one of the first social virtual worlds that got kind of like widespread attention outside the core audience. Right, you could see Second Life stuff on magazines and like, but not just Wired, also like the New York Times. You could see it in like on TV, on the news. It was becoming part of pop culture. So, and also in many ways, Second Life was a protocol, since today totally inconceivable. It could be accessed with the official game client, or there were third-party developed clients for it, which almost made it like a protocol. And a couple of years later, so the numbers, if you look, the infographic, they did an infographic where they kind of like celebrated the 10 years in Second Life. And within that 10 years, these are the stats. They have like 36 million accounts, more than 1 million visits per month, 3.2 billion. So big jump from, well, this is over 10 years, but I think in the first, even like by 2007, the GDP was around 3 billion. So massive step up from EverQuest. But again, this is back to sandboxes usually have a more player-driven economy, since the players are supposed to do it. And this is also why it got so much attention, right? They also were the first one to allow what they called residents, right? Inhabitants were residents. They allowed them to own their own digital creations. Content creation was a thing in Second Life. And they said, well, we revised the term of services so that creators retain full ownership of their in-world content. All right, before EverQuest, Star Wars Galaxies, the Station Exchange, Sony Online had the rights to do it, and then the big shift under Second Life was they own the content. Whoever makes the content creates the content. Whoever creates the content owns the content. So huge change. And so we got people who literally made even more money. Like everybody's pointing to Anshi Chung as that's an in-player game, but like as the first like reported Second Life millionaire. Probably there were people before that, but she came kind of like the face of Second Life. She was on the cover of magazines, and she made the money with selling property. Let me check. Yeah, that's a good one. Dink. Right, so that's from 2006, and oh God, seriously? Yes? No? Maybe? Anyway, if you if you look it up, you can check Anshi Chung, and so there were now it's kind of like, oh, this is not just fun and games, this is actual an economy at an economy scale. Even if EverQuest 2 was already at an economy scale, this was kind of like huge. And so Second Life did a lot of these things that we now kind of like find again, rediscover as, oh yeah, virtual land. Yes, we had that. We know how it works. Virtual items and creation and creator economy. Yes, exactly. We know exactly how that works. So yeah, Second Life did a lot of firsts. Actually, it still exists. But like this is back to, what does an actual curve of a typical virtual world look like? And the answer is, well, a lot of people play, but then users drop off. And yes, there's a long tail, but usually you have a very defined hype cycle, and then afterwards it drops out massively. And typical, I don't know what the average like life cycle of an MMO is, but I would probably guess 1 to 2 years. Because if your high is not high enough that your long tail is actually meaningful, so you can sustain your game long term, you're in trouble. And not many make it beyond the 5-year mark. Very, very few make it beyond the 10-year mark. And you could argue that a lot of these lists are actually way beyond 10 years. But Ultima Online is gone. Yes, there are a couple of fan servers. Second Life, yes, it exists, but with way less users. World of Warcraft, I mean, it plummeted from, in its height, what, 16, almost like 20 million concurrent subscribers, to now 2, 3, which is, don't get me wrong, still a lot of money, but like not compared to that height. So if your height is not high enough, it kind of like, it's very hard to get that long tail. EVE Online also, even older than World of Warcraft and still going strong, but I don't know, 1 million, 2 players. So it's very hard, and the curve is very predictable how this goes for virtual worlds over time. And so EVE Online, EVE, the big EVE, I love Eve. Eve has probably the most realistic and complex economic system as a core gameplay mechanic, to the point where people describe it as an Excel sheet simulator. Watching EVE Online streams on Twitch is probably the most, depending on what you define fun, is either the most boring thing you've ever encountered or the most relaxing thing you've ever encountered, because nothing really happens. Even if you're supposedly in the middle of a hardcore PvP fight between thousands of players, it's still going to look like a very relaxing experience, because literally nothing happens. Because all the power and all the tension and all the fun and interesting thing is in the economic system. And the most interesting thing here is they publish a monthly economic report going into, again, knowing the audience, an absurd amount of detail in what happens in the economy. Because this is the core gameplay loop, essentially, shifting money around. Like, hey, what's production versus destruction? What's like key economic figures by region? Total destroyed by region, which makes sense because it's kind of like a sink, right? Asteroid ore volume by region. This is the faucet, right? This is your drain. This is your faucet. Asteroid ore mined over time. So again, if this is too annoying and too dry for you, yeah, welcome to Eve. But it's super interesting because the big innovation that Eve did. Remember before when I talked about sharding, and that worlds have a specific amount, the designers decide that world have a specific amount of players that the world can sustain. And this might be for world reasons, for design reasons, for resource reasons, but also server resources are also a resource. So it might be that the server can only handle a couple of thousand players before it actually crashes or before we get into performance issues. And EVE Online did the unthinkable and said we have one huge shard. Everybody plays literally in the same instance. Their maximum amount, so at one point they had like a couple of years ago, it was like 600,000 concurrent users. Concurrent users, EVE Online record. It is like literally hundreds of thousands of players online at the same time. Because the world of EVE is huge. Like when you start playing and you kind of like see the map and the map is zoomed in. Like this is your immediate neighborhood. And then you zoom out. 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 It's this absurdly huge world of many star systems. EVE Online map. It is huge. Let me see if I find a map. And this is like thousands and thousands and thousands of star systems. Here are actually loads and loads of star systems. Right? If you see, these are also specific factions, and these are literally, you could zoom in, like, oh yeah, zoom, 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 and by the way, each dot is a star system which contains multiple planets. So it's insanely huge. And I essentially said, we get rid of this sharding, everybody's playing at the same thing, which is kind of a cop-out because they have an amazing server setup that does automatic load balancing, because essentially each like star system is its own shard. It's like an instance. The technology behind it is amazing. And just like they publish a lot of information around the economy, they publish a lot around their technology as well. Their tech is absolutely bonkers. But this also makes the economy bigger, right? And it leads to emergent behavior. So like in the beginning when EVE was new, like 2004-ish, the game client was very basic. And this is just an anecdote. Game client was pretty basic. And you had Russian players. And Russian players were mostly... So in the middle, there is a safe space. That's called Security 1, where player-to-player combat is discouraged because there's a police. And the police will essentially fire upon if people kill other players, fight and attack other players. And the security status will be lower and lower until you get to the outer edges, where it's like literally zero police. Do what you want. Good luck. So as people started going, they essentially roughly clustered by country and culture, which kind of makes sense. You speak English, you want to be with English speakers. You speak German, you want to be with German speakers. You speak Russian, you want to be with Russian players, Asian players, and so on. So kind of makes sense. And the game client couldn't really handle UTF-8. And so, for example, Asian players would have a hard time communicating because it wouldn't allow them to type in their specific character set. Russian players as well, Eastern European players. So everybody who wasn't necessarily able to Arabic players wouldn't necessarily be able to type in a normal typeset, but had to use like workarounds. They use plugins essentially or modded game clients. But that made it so that they could type in their natural character set, but each players without the specific mod would see gibberish. So not normal characters, but literally like character errors, which annoyed the people. And of course, players are players. They started kill on sight for everybody who wasn't using the native character set, which led to the first huge faction war, where pretty much everybody else versus people with US character set. Totally emergent player behavior. And that was very early in EVE, and I think the EVE team looked at that and said, cool, universe-wide war as emergent behavior in our sandbox. And kind of they went from there. They pretty much allowed the players to do what they want. But they made a couple of very forward-looking things. Like for one thing would be this sharding thing. The other one, and let me look this up, EVE Online Player Council. At some point, they created a Council of Stellar Management. And this is essentially where players could vote for representatives of themselves from the gaming community, and they can represent the players in front of the developers. They can bring forward suggestions. They can essentially ask for new features. They can give feedback. And the interesting thing is, it's somewhere in here. You can look at it, but there was this PDF originally from CCP, the creators of EVE, in that they outline a kind of like declaration of players' rights within their world, where they went beyond Second Life, where they say you own specific parts of the community, but like you even own specific, maybe not own specific parts of the game, but we give you a seat at the table, at our table, us the creators of this world. Really, really interesting. And this is still going. They've been doing this for a decade or something. And of course, there's a meta game who's actually getting the vote, and that, of course, it's a game about economy, and it's a game around with very little rules and governance. So it's mostly about cheating, scamming, spies, about dismantling other factions, corporations. It's a cutthroat game. It's like really player-to-player, roguelike, hardcore experience. And of course, part of that experience is that you manipulate the election by buying votes, by promising things, but that's part of the metagame. So EVE Online, fascinating thing, and there are a lot of papers around this, around the economy itself. If you want, you can look up on YouTube EVE Economy. There are economists writing about this. There are like articles like this, well, that really dig deep into the economy. Again, EVE is a game for economists, but it's super, super interesting. That's an amazing rabbit hole. If you like virtual economies, this is an amazing rabbit hole, because there's just like decades and decades of data around here. Super interesting. So, and here we are in the beginning. These two folks. How do I start? So obviously I looked at, okay, we saw a lot about them in the news, right? Sandbox, Atari bought a lot of stuff, Adidas bought in, Ubisoft bought, and we can actually look it up. Sandbox, the game. So Sandbox is, I don't actually think Sandbox is a sandbox. If you go, if you are on that spectrum between a theme park and a sandbox, I actually think the Sandbox is closer to a theme park game than an actual sandbox. It's a decentralized, community-driven gaming ecosystem. Okay, cool. So the point is to share and monetize assets on the Ethereum blockchain. So essentially they created a world where you could create game assets, trade those game assets, and then that's pretty much the game. And they have this, where's the map? This is the map, where I think there was a bit of a different view, where each parcel can be essentially owned. You can buy them from the Sandbox with real money. Essentially, all of this is based on Ethereum as a blockchain, and it's browser based, but it's a Second Life-like experience. And if you think back to resources, the resources are sand, which is essentially their currency. It's a central currency. And you will need to you will need that stuff to essentially buy. It's essentially the money. And what they also do, much like Second Life, is they give you full ownership of the assets that you create. So for example, you create a hat for somebody to wear, you create a character skin, you create blah, blah, blah. So you own that. Much like Second Life. There are a couple of interesting questions around sand, which is... Yes, I'm sorry. It is a limited supply resource. There will always ever be 3 billion sand. Remember what I said about closed ecosystems and limited amount resources? This is a, by definition and by design, this is a zero-sum game. Not only is they claim a limit of 3 billion sand, but also the land you can buy, the map, is also supposedly finite. So, and land is, hey, I have a map, I can buy land. Where's the, can I literally click here? Oh, discover the map. So supposedly this is the entire map that will exist that you can buy. So land is also a finite resource. So both of your central resources are zero-sum game-based resources. And what will happen, what traditionally previous game designs have shown is, first of all, people hoard, right? The whole thing is, if you have a central resource, people will keep hanging onto it instead using it in the way you intended to. So most of that 3 billion sand will actually sit in some wallets and not be used for actual exchange. It will be, for all intents and purposes, an investment asset. But then you also, since it is a limited resource, the issue is that you will have depreciation by design. So as more and more people come to the game, and as the game scales, more and more people will have to share the finite resources. Meaning that the overall buying power will depreciate and the whole thing will fall apart. So they have two choices. And probably they will do both. Number one, suddenly come up with oh, there's more land. The aquatic expansion, the space expansion. Making all the people that paid a lot of money for the current land that they thought was exclusive an idiotic choice. Essentially devaluating everything. Like, look at World of Warcraft. If you would have spent, if like World of Warcraft promised, oh no, we're never doing an expansion, then, I don't know, pick one. The Azure Song Mage Blade that drops in Molten Core is one of the best weapons for casters. It would be worth thousands and thousands of real-world US dollars. But then as soon as the expansion comes out and the item level doubles, it's essentially render trash. This is what happened. Like every hardcore raiding guild that spent like month and month and month of incrementally increasing the item level suddenly saw all their value gone. Now, that isn't necessarily a problem if your world is based on an experience. Oh, I still have the experience. I still have the experience of playing with friends. But if literally the only experience you have is buying and selling and trading, then congratulations. Once you do that, you devaluate also all the experience. So yeah, Ulf, it doesn't make sense. Limited supply of of land doesn't make sense, and they will change it. They will eventually, especially if this scales and more people actually. So the weird thing is, this currently works because no one is literally playing. If you look at the numbers of the sandbox for the first alpha, they had what is it? Meow meow. They claimed they had around 200K visitors in their first alpha session, 200,000 visitors, which is nothing. They also said these 200,000 visitors on average totally played 150,000 hours, which means on average, each player didn't even play an hour. So honestly, that's like not even a blip. But as they scale, if they actually scale into the millions of players, they will have an issue. And the only way to circumvent the problem, again, historically, we've been through this, is they need to expand and announce the expansion of being able to offering new land. And by the way, then they have the problem of the money, which is also a fixed supply. So eventually they will either expand the amount of supply of expand the supply of sand, or if they cannot do that, first of all, you might argue, oh, this is on Ethereum, it's a smart contract, and my answer would be, so I can change the smart contract. They're the owner of the smart contract. Oh, they did lock it, so they will offer a secondary resource, sand 2 or rocks. And rocks, there will be a conversion rate where 1 sand is 10 rocks or something. And by the way, we're deprecating sand. The game client will not longer accept sand in 6 months. Again, even if you're on the blockchain, the game creator has full control over the world. If you think, oh no, this is finite resource and it's protected by some arbitrary smart contract, this is a social construct. To save, if they keep both fixed supply and a zero-sum game, they will lose control over their world. And to avoid that, they have to do that. And the same is true for Decentraland. Same thing, they made exactly the same decisions where they based the economy around a closed system of finite central resources, which in game design terms, in virtual world economy terms, is insane, because we've seen that it doesn't work. It works if you have few enough players, but as soon as you're scaling, it gets destroyed. And I'm not even talking about the ethical decision around choosing Ethereum as a blockchain and the environmental decisions. I'm not talking about that using that blockchain is a stupid thing in itself, because it's not able to scale because of the limits in transactions per second. You could that is a technological discussion that you can have, or an ethical discussion that you can have. But even beyond that, from the pure virtual world design, this does not make sense. And that's my issue. So long term, this thing, if this scales, is a very weird thing. That said, though, I think the investments that have been done here, like by Adidas and Ubisoft and the others, I do think they make sense. Which people usually, like, after I give my rant of how this thing is doomed, they look at me and kind of like don't get it together. But kind of like, if you look at it, what Adidas has done, they have paid what, 2.5 million for a billboard that they can run and a press release that they get. And if you think around what a social campaign costs them, in terms of somebody needs to produce assets, somebody needs to come up with a creative idea, they need to pay a creative agency, and they need to pay They need to pay for the advertising, and that also costs a couple of million. So by buying that for supposedly a lot of money, which honestly for Adidas and their advertising budget is not a lot of money, by doing that, they have a great ad campaign. This is a PR and advertising play. And they get access to more resources. Their stock price will increase. They get more access to talent. Like Nike plays this to a T. It doesn't make sense if they actually make money. Adidas doesn't care if they make money in this Decentraland store they have. They will probably use it for exhibitions and stuff, and like making like advertising, presenting the new shoe that you can now buy online. But it's a billboard. They make, if they would invest it in a real store, they would make way more money. But if you look at it, again, it's a very, very defined. Well, first of all, it's a very defined audience that they have. Probably like white middle-aged males with a lot of income to spare. Who's playing Sandbox in Decentraland, really? Probably a very defined amount. So it's a very targeted advertising as well. And then you have a continuous billboard in front of those people, which you still need to create assets for, but essentially it's another channel to play into. And Nike is playing this even further, where they say, oh yeah, we have an entire metaverse group of people. And I think these kind of like metaverse groups that people build up internally, or organizations build up internally, they're the new innovation lab. Remember when a couple of years ago, everybody was doing these like innovation labs? We have people and they're in a building and they're doing innovation things. And it's the same thing. It doesn't matter. Nobody cared. And these things died after a couple of years, after people know, oh, well, we don't get any return on investment over it. But it was, hopefully for most, it wasn't actually about return on investment. It was around not return on investment in core business, like efficiency, profitability and things, but a return on investment on a brand side of things, because the brand itself, Nike, right now is seen as the new hip thing. They get access to more funding, they get access to more talent by doing that. So even if nothing comes out of it, even if their metaverse people will never help them create better shoes, produce shoes more cheaply, or even make money with virtual shoes, just by being there, Nike has better access to capital and has better access to talents. And that's worth the money. So I'm very bullish on doing it. I'm just also saying you need to be careful not to overestimate the role of what you're doing here. It's mostly a brand play, an advertising play, and a PR play. And yeah, it's Ulf, correct. It's a narrative, right? And then there's nothing wrong with the narrative. It's like, I'm not one of the tech people who say marketing is stupid because it's not real. I worked in marketing for 10 years. Marketing makes sense. So yeah, this is a narrative play and not a core play in terms of making money. So, but back to the Sandbox and Decentraland, I think that their design is short-sighted, and maybe that's the point. Maybe it's just a short cash grab to kind of like cash in, which would be really sad, because looking at the Sandbox and the way they structure it, how they put it up, how they kind of they obviously went a lot of thinking in the technology, and there went a lot of thinking in like looking through that, how they structured the market, how they created the tools, how they documented it. I like it very much. So I think it would be, I personally think it would be sad if it's just a cash grab to now run away with the millions of brands, and this never scales. But and that's kind of the thing where like initially I stumbled over, oh, this is fixed core resources, this cannot work. And I think eventually they will understand that, and the obvious choice is expansions in land and sand. And I wonder how the community, if it really will scale, will react to that. Yeah, but finally we got there. After only 2 hours, we got there what I think about Decentraland and Sandbox. And by the way, the choice of using NFTs was also just stupid. There's too much rampant hacking and fraud around NFTs. There's literally no security. It's like using a format without inherent security, where security is almost impossible based on the technology it's based on. Like if you look at Reddit, NFT stealing in Sandbox is rampant. And that's also annoying because things will not scale if there's rampant fraud and rampant hacking. And I'm not even talking like player-to-player fraud. That's fine if you make that a core mechanic, and if people are fine, if players are okay with that, like in Eve. But like this is just external hacking, and hacking is never good for a game. They can essentially ignore it and say, "Oh yeah, learn it." I don't know, not your key, not your hat. But that's not the point. NFT hacking is rampant because the core technology sucks because it's not secured. And basing your game on of that, they probably again did it because Web3 and the narrative, because NFTs are cool. But this is probably the only like real tech decision they made that I dislike, because I think it's really stupid because it's opening up to so much external fraud and hacking that they cannot stop because they literally don't like own this core technology or like the protocol. So also prediction, they will first do their own blockchain, and okay, Ethereum, as they scale, they cannot scale with Ethereum. And even like going with Polygon doesn't really help them, or any L2. They announced their own L2, which will eventually happen, that they have under control and get the hacking problem under control. So they announce their own, what do you call it? Enterprise controlled blockchain. And once they have that, they will just do the proper abstraction, take a proper database, get rid of the blockchain, and do a central exchange. Because it makes sense. So yeah, that's another prediction that they probably will do. As they scale, they must take this technology in-house to be able to scale, because the stuff they built it on doesn't scale and it's not secure. See, I told you, I love talking about virtual economies. We're 2 hours in, and I feel like I didn't talk too much, but you probably are asleep all. So, yeah. But I like this stuff. Virtual economies are cool. Yelf, basically making it centralized again. Because, again, virtual worlds are centralized. That's kind of the point. You're in full control over your world. You need to cater to your design goals, because every world has very different design goals and thus need to structure their economy very differently. There is no open economy. If for example, Sandbox has 3 billion sand. I don't know actually how much money Decentraland minted, but if they did 3 million, then you need an exchange course. Who defines the exchange course 10 to 1? So there still needs to be a central instance that defines the translation between currencies. And if you then have a virtual economy that is based around that is open and based around a positive sum game where you're injecting money all the time with a faucet, how can you then take billions and billions potentially an ever-growing amount of money in an economy in a closed economy? Like if another game on the blockchain is creating and minting more and more money because they have a faucet-based open economy, will it ever be possible to have a kind of like translation. Probably that needs to be dynamic. Who defines the dynamic? That needs to be a central instance. So again, this stuff just from an economy point of view, and I'm not even talking about game design like taking a Star Wars Galaxies blaster into World of Warcraft and be able to destroy everything. Not from a game design perspective. We're not even there. We're on a purely economy point of view, and that's tricky. As again, there's so many different types to play this that it really becomes tricky to have an. Essentially, the only way to have a decentralized system would be if everybody agrees on that participates in this decentralized world to have the same rules. And good luck with that. Because at the end of the day, you would need a consortium, and then you're back to centralization again, because at this point, there will be people disagree who want to make another type of a game, so they built another consortium. And so you get to, the only way to decentralize is to have many, many centralized things and actually have a choice where you go. Competition solves this problem. The issue with big tech is not necessarily that they're too big and centralized. The problem is that we don't have competition. We should have regulation around competition to break them up, to create more competition in the market. So I'm more like make this a micro problem, but like the problem of creating something fully decentralized is too big. Or maybe I'm wrong. Or maybe people are smarter than me and are solving this problem, which would be cool. Nothing against that. I'm old, maybe I'm too old and don't see how it would work, which is perfectly fine. I'm not that smart. Well, this was fun. A good Friday evening to distract from everything else outside and talk about world-to-world economies. This was lovely. This was a much needed rest. You all, I wish you a restful evening. Be mindful in these crazy times. Take care of yourself. Take care of whoever you can. I wish you all an amazing, amazing weekend. Stay safe and healthy. And I think we end it here. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you all for participating who are here. Thank you for listening after the fact. If you're watching this, if you actually made it through 2 hours afterwards. Yeah, this is fun. Thank you all for turning out, and thank you all for the questions. We should have coffee. So, everybody, have an awesome weekend. Take care.
Do unfamiliar glare, it blocks me out, I'm blinded. Inspired by